In 14th-century York church court records describe a punishment reserved almost entirely for women. A public walk through the market square. A plain white shift, bare feet on cold stone, a lit candle trembling in one hand. The whole town turned out to watch and said almost nothing. Most people assumed the worst thing that could happen to a woman accused of adultery in the Middle Ages was a quick, dramatic execution. But what historians, combing through surviving court archives, have actually uncovered about daily life in medieval Europe is far stranger, far messier, and far more fascinating than anything you were ever taught in school. Marriage in medieval Europe was never simply a private matter between two people. It was a legal contract, a property arrangement, and from the wedding vow to the deathbed confession, it was something the church considered entirely its own business. By the 12th century, authority over marriage and sexual conduct had shifted almost completely into the hands of ecclesiastical courts. Courts run by bishops and their officials, applying what was known as canon law, meaning law made and enforced by the church rather than by kings. These courts heard cases of suspected adultery in towns across England, France, and the Holy Roman Empire. They decided who could marry. They decided who could seek an annulment, since true divorce in the modern sense barely existed. And they decided who would be punished and exactly how when a marriage bed was betrayed. Historian James Brundage, whose landmark study, Law, Sex, and Christian Society in Medieval Europe, remains one of the most thorough accounts of this legal world, traced how penance became the church's primary weapon. Confession, fasting on bread and water, sometimes for years at a time. Exclusion from communion, which, in a society built entirely around shared religious ritual, functioned as its own quiet form of social death. Execution for adultery, while present on paper in a handful of early Germanic law codes, was rarely carried out by the height of the medieval period. The real terror lived somewhere else entirely. It lived in public exposure. Court records from York, part of an archive now preserved at the Borthwick Institute, describe women ordered to process barefoot through crowded streets, dressed in penitential white, stopping at designated points to be struck lightly with rods, not enough to maim, but enough to humiliate in full view of neighbors, in-laws, and former friends. Legal historian Sarah Butler, who has spent years studying English ecclesiastical court records, has shown that these public penances were built around shame as the actual mechanism of punishment, calibrated to communities small enough that everyone would know precisely what had happened and to whom. Reputation in a medieval town functioned almost like currency. Once spent, it rarely came back. Why target reputation instead of the body? Because a woman's standing determined nearly everything else available to her: her ability to remarry, her claim to her dower, the portion of land or property a widow was legally entitled to draw from her late husband's estate after his death, her children's legitimacy, and with it, their right to inherit anything at all. An accusation of adultery threatened the single thing medieval property law cared about most: certainty over who a child's father actually was. A man could divide his land confidently among his sons only if he was confident those sons were his own. That anxiety, arguably more than morality on its own, shaped how much more harshly women's infidelity was punished compared to men's. And the double standard was staggering. Husbands who strayed faced spiritual penance too, at least in theory. In practice, surviving court records show their cases were prosecuted far less often and punished far more lightly when they were. A man's adultery rarely threatened the bloodline running through his household. A woman's did. Historian Ruth Mazo-Karras, whose research has reshaped how scholars understand medieval sexuality and gender, has argued that this asymmetry wasn't an accident or an oversight. It was the entire architecture of medieval sexual law, built to protect inheritance rather than to enforce any equal standard of morality. Did medieval people themselves notice this hypocrisy? Some clearly did. Surviving sermons occasionally scolded husbands for their own infidelities in one breath while condemning their wives in the next. Evidence that the double standard was visible even at the time, not just to modern eyes looking back at it centuries later. None of this looked the same for every woman either. For peasant women working the land, punishment for adultery rarely came from a bishop at all. It came from the manor court, the local tribunal run by a lord's steward to handle disputes and offenses among the people who farmed his land. Historian Judith Bennett, who has spent decades reconstructing the lives of medieval English peasant women through surviving manorial records, has documented a fine called leirvite, a payment owed to the lord himself when a woman under his authority was found guilty of illicit sex. Why would a lord care about his tenant's marriage bed? Because in a manorial economy, a woman's labor and household standing were bound up entirely with her lord's permission and oversight. Her marriage, in many cases, required his approval. An accusation of adultery wasn't only a moral failing in this world. It functioned almost like damaged property, and the fine operated less like punishment for sin and more like compensation owed to the man who controlled her household's place on his land. Beyond the church courts, ordinary communities ran their own brutal system of justice that operated entirely outside official law. In parts of France and England, neighbors organized what became known as a charivari, a loud, mocking procession staged outside the home of someone accused of adultery, complete with pots banged like drums. Jeering crowds gathered in the street, and sometimes an effigy of the accused paraded backward on a donkey for the whole village to see. No judge ordered this. No court ever recorded it in any official register. It was simply a community policing itself, loudly and publicly, sometimes for days on end, until the shame became unbearable enough to drive an entire family out of town for good. This is the version of medieval justice that almost never makes it into film. Not a dramatic execution, a slow, grinding social siege carried out by people the accused had known her entire life in the only town she had ever called home. Some legal codes went much further than shame alone. In early 11th century England, under the laws issued during the reign of King Canute, an adulterous wife could legally forfeit her property to her husband, and under the harshest provisions recorded in the text, lose her nose and her ears. Historians studying Anglo-Saxon law generally agree that how often this specific mutilation was actually carried out, rather than simply existing on the page as a deterrent, remains genuinely uncertain. Surviving evidence is thin, and written law codes don't always reflect lived practice. But its presence in the text at all tells you something the public shaming rituals only hint at. Medieval lawmakers considered female adultery serious enough to legislate in writing a punishment that permanently disfigured the body. Here's where the story gets even stranger. Travel east into the Byzantine Empire, and a startlingly similar punishment appears in a completely separate legal tradition. Under reforms descended from Justinian's 6th century legal code and later revised in the 8th century Ecloga, a Byzantine legal handbook issued under Emperor Leo III, a wife convicted of adultery could be forcibly confined to a convent for the rest of her life, her hair cut short, her marriage dissolved, her husband left free to remarry while she lived out her remaining years behind monastery walls. Some surviving Byzantine legal texts describe nose-slitting as a sanctioned punishment for adultery during certain periods as well, a mutilation meant to permanently mark and permanently disfigure the body of the accused. Two cultures separated by thousands of miles and centuries of independent legal development somehow arrived at strikingly similar conclusions about how to punish a woman's body for a crime against a marriage contract. What does it say that two such different legal worlds landed on the same brutal idea, almost as if neither one needed to learn it from the other? Perhaps the strangest twist of all has nothing to do with punishment after guilt was proven, and everything to do with how guilt got proven in the first place. In a legal process known as compurgation, an accused person could clear their name by gathering a set number of people willing to swear an oath vouching for their honesty, rather than presenting physical evidence. Sarah Butler's archival research has found that women frequently needed more oath helpers than men to clear the exact same charge, because a woman's word on its own simply carried less legal weight in these courts. Suspicion functioned almost like proof. A jealous husband, a gossiping neighbor, a resentful mother-in-law. Any of these could trigger a formal accusation that, once filed, was nearly impossible to fully erase from a woman's reputation, regardless of the court's eventual verdict. Guilty or innocent, the rumor itself often became the real sentence. What's strange is how familiar all of this still feels. Public shaming as a tool of social control never actually disappeared. It simply changed venues. The medieval charivari, with its mocking crowd and irreversible reputational damage, has an unmistakable modern echo in how accusations spread today, where a single story can destroy someone's standing within hours, long before any formal process has determined what actually happened. The medieval market square and the modern comment section run on a strikingly similar uncomfortable principle. Shame travels faster than verdicts. Reputations rarely recover fully once an accusation goes public, regardless of what's ultimately proven true or false. But how much of any of this actually happened versus simply existing on paper as a threat? Historians continue to debate exactly how often these harshest penalties were enforced versus simply written into law and rarely applied in practice. Court attendance records suggest plenty of accused women never showed up at all, vanishing from a town rather than facing a procession through its center. Surviving archives are incomplete, weighted heavily toward the literate and the prosperous, and largely silent on the countless lives that left no written trace whatsoever. What we actually know about medieval adultery law comes from fragments, court rolls, penitential manuals, the occasional surviving sermon or chronicle. Our picture of it keeps shifting as more archives are digitized and re-examined by new generations of researchers. And any honest account of this history has to hold its conclusions loosely, the same way the historians who study it do. So when people imagine adultery in the Middle Ages, they tend to picture one dramatic, decisive moment: a sword, a scaffold, a single, brutal scene. The reality, pieced together from court rolls in York, the law codes of Canute's England, and the eerily similar punishments codified in empire away in Byzantium, was almost always slower and stranger than that. It was a barefoot walk through a silent crowd, a law written to disfigure a body that more often than not was never actually touched, a reputation that once broken simply never came back. It really was truly terrifying to commit adultery in the Middle Ages, just not in the end for the reason most people expect.